Hi everyone, I'm Land Cable Missionary, Damascus. Today I'm gonna introduce a book called Dominion. One day, a publisher named 책과 함께 sent me Korean version. Have you ever seen Korean version?
Haven't been sent to me yet, but I look forward to it. Looks very handsome.
Yeah, looks handsome, yeah. So, this giant book called Dominion and requested me to make a video about this. So I started to read this, and after I read the only preface, I sent an email to the publisher right away. What did I say? I said, please invite the author to my channel so that I can make a astonishing video. Honestly, I thought it wasn't gonna happen, but they made it. So here's the author. Tom Holland is a popular history author in England. He got many awards for his fiction and non-fiction books. And especially he wrote many great books about Asian history such as Roman Empire. His recently published book called Dominion, which is our interview topic, is about how Christianity became a cornerstone of Western society and Western mind. Welcome to our channel. Would you please tell us about yourself a little bit and the purpose of this book, Dominion?
Yes, I am British. I live in London. I was brought up in a village outside London, about 100 miles from London. Your viewers may have seen Stonehenge, the famous prehistoric monument. I was brought up about 10 miles from that. And I was raised Christian. My mother is a devout member of the Church of England. So I went to church. I went to Sunday school. I loved the Bible as a child. I loved all the stories. But the truth is that I preferred the pharaohs and the kings of Assyria and the kings of Babylon to the children of Israel. I found them much more glamorous and exciting. And in the New Testament, I found the Romans far more interesting than the apostles.
Yeah.
And the truth was that even though I was going to Sunday school, I actually found the Greeks and the Romans and the Syrians and the Egyptians far more glamorous and exciting.
Yeah, in Bible.
Yeah, and so over the course of my teenage years and then into my adult life, I guess my Christian faith faded away, and instead the great passion of my life was particularly Rome, the Roman Empire. And so for the past 20 years, I've been writing books particularly on ancient Rome, but also Greece and Persia and early medieval Europe. And increasingly, I came to feel that Rome was a very alien, a very frightening, still fascinating, still charismatic, but very, very different from almost everything that I was and that the world that I lived in was. And so it began to kind of open my eyes to the degree to which actually I was Christian, because I came to see that Christianity had actually been a far more profound, a far deeper break with the Roman world than I had understood. And in a sense, therefore, Dominion is an attempt to make amends for the mistake I think that I made in my childhood in thinking that I was more of a Roman than I was a Christian. And really, the book covers, it's not just the 2,000 years of Christianity's history, it's about kind of 500 years before that as well, to give a portrait of what the world was like before Christianity, what the various elements were that fed into Christianity, what the elements of the Roman world were that made it very different to the Christian world that emerges, and then to see whether those Christian influences have passed through essentially into the modern West. So that's my focus. I did think about writing about Korea because the story of how Christianity came in Korea and the incredible growth is such an interesting one. But in the end, you held the book up. You saw how huge it was. I just decided at the end I didn't have room. I would like to apologize to everyone in Korea for that.
Please write one more book.
I will.
In the future,
Yes, I will.
Yeah, thank you. So you already mentioned your childhood, but could you please tell us about what led you to leave Christianity in more detail? or how did you feel
Yeah,
about Roman
well,
Empire and things like that?
okay, well, I guess it happened on two levels. One was as a boy, a small boy, I was very interested in dinosaurs. I was one of those boys who loved dinosaurs, and I knew everything about
So
them.
do I. Yeah.
Yeah, and I went to I said I went to Sunday school, and in the Sunday school there was a children's
Yeah.
Bible, and it showed on the first page it showed the Adam and Eve in the Garden of
Right.
Eden.
Right.
And there were all kinds of animals there. So there were parrots and snakes and lions, and there was a brachiosaur. And I immediately knew that, and there were Adam and Eve, and I knew that this couldn't be right because no human beings had ever seen a sauropod. And so I asked the Sunday school teacher, and she didn't really know how to answer. And so I had just a faint hint of doubt there, rather like someone in Darwin's England. A kind of slight sense of doubt there. But also it was just the fact that I guess what I loved about dinosaurs was that they were fierce and glamorous. And I think that the Romans were fierce and glamorous. And I didn't find the apostles or even Jesus to be very fierce and glamorous at all. And I found the Greek gods, so Apollo, Athena, whoever, Dionysus, to be much more interesting than the Christian God. And I think it was just that emotionally I was more engaged by the Roman world than I was by the world of the Israelites, the Jews, whatever, and the early Christianity. And I had a kind of image in my mind, and I'm speaking as quite a young child at this point, that in the Roman Empire, the skies had always been blue. And that when Christianity came, suddenly it was like a wintry day. Cold grey clouds had descended. I mean, obviously ridiculous. There was just as much blue sky in the Christian period as there was in the Roman period. But it's just the way the mind worked. And I think that that's very revelatory about the way, and it's not just me, that quite a lot of people, certainly in the West, have come to see the classical world as somehow free of a kind of repressive quality that they associate with Christianity. And essentially, Dominion is my attempt to make amends for that, because I now recognize that I was completely wrong about that. I now recognize that the Roman world was much more frightening, and that if I had a choice of living in the Roman world or the Christian world, I would go for the Christian world every time.
Thank you for the answer. The first half of the book, or your discussion with N.T. Wright, seem to tell us that the crucifixion of Christ has reversed the notion of who a victim is. What can the cross of Jesus tell us at a time when more and more people become victims of hate, violence, and even the lasting disasters such as COVID-19?
Well, when I was writing the book, I was a couple of chapters into the book. I made a documentary for a British television company here in London about the Islamic State and what they were doing in northern Iraq. And I went to visit there was a monastery on the front with ISIS. And I also went to a place called Sinjar, which had been a town full of Yazidis, who were a religious minority in northern Iraq, who the Islamic State fighters accused of being devil worshippers, completely wrongly. I mean, they weren't at all, but that's what they were accused of being. And so the Islamic State rounded up, when they moved in 2014 and captured the city, they rounded up all the women and girls and sold them as slaves. And they killed the men, and they crucified some of the men. And I went there 2 years later, just after the town had fallen to the Kurds, but the Islamic State was still a mile away across open land. And so I went to this town, which was completely shattered. And it was the closest that I'd ever been to being in a town kind of akin to the Romans storming it. Because the Romans, when they stormed towns, would kill the men and enslave the women and crucify those who had resisted them. And to be in a town where people had suffered crucifixion, and where the people who had done this were, they could still fire mortars at the town. They were that close. Suddenly opened up my mind, my this kind of abyss in front of me, where I realized what the cross had meant for the Romans. And I'd understood this, intellectually up here in my head, but I hadn't understood it in the heart. And I felt it like a kind of great surge of emotional understanding. The scale of what Christianity had done by turning the cross in the Roman world from symbolizing the power of the imperial state to undermining it. Because to the Romans, the cross was an emblem of their ability to torture to death anyone who opposed them, whether this was people in the provinces of the empire or whether it was slaves rebelling against their masters. And the cross was the most horrible death imaginable. And so that's why in the Roman imagination, it was particularly associated with slaves. It was the right punishment, the fitting punishment for slaves, because not only was it agonizing, not only was it protracted, but it was public and humiliating. And the humiliation was the point. A slave nailed to a cross served as an advertisement of Roman power.
Yeah.
So you can see how completely shocking the teachings, say, of Paul, and his letters are the earliest Christian texts we have, saying that it's what's shocking to the Romans is not the idea that a man might become a god, because Augustus Caesar had become a god, Julius Caesar had become a god, lots of people had become gods. It was the idea that a man nailed to a cross and suffering death as a criminal might be God. That was what was shocking. And Paul himself knew it was shocking. There's a sense throughout his letters that he can't quite believe what he's saying. He says that this is a stumbling block to the Jews and it's madness to the Gentiles.
Right. And
he felt that incredibly strongly. And Christian writings throughout the early centuries of Christianity, again and again, Christians seem almost embarrassed by it. I mean, it's kind of, they're saying, this is the most shocking thing, that someone who suffered crucifixion became God. But it's true. It's true. It's the most amazing thing, but it is shocking. And that's why even 100 years after Constantine, when the Roman Empire has been being Christian for a century, it's only then that you start to get illustrations of Jesus on the cross being done by Christians. And even then, Jesus is shown as a kind of athlete. He's shown kind of muscles, like he's a competitor in the Olympic Games or something. It takes another 500 years after that, so in AD 1000, for Jesus to be shown dead on a cross. And that's the measurement of just how shocking the whole idea was. I think that certainly we in the West, and it may be different in Korea because it's much more recent. Christianity is much more recent in Korea, but here in England, where we've been Christian for 1,000 years and more, right. I think we have become desensitized to what the cross represents. It took a shock, like going to this town where people had been crucified, to kind of open my eyes to just how shocking the revolution that Christianity represents had been. That's right. So that's what I really wanted to try and do in the book, was to kind of emphasize just how strange it was. And so when I came back from Iraq, having been to Sinjar, I rewrote the opening of the book to focus on crucifixion, because I suddenly realized that this was the key. This is, there's a reason why the cross is the symbol of Christianity, because it's the most shocking thing imaginable.
Right. Yeah.
And it should be shocking, and Christianity should be shocking.
Even today, some people say how God is so weak or so personal.
It's a paradox. And everything
it's
about
paradox, right? Yeah.
Everything about Christianity is a paradox, I think.
Great. Yeah. You mentioned slavery. So
yeah.
You devoted almost a chapter to the topics of slavery. So there are still many people who say that Christianity promoted slavery or the oppression of women, something like that. So usually those who claim so blame Paul. So how do you address this?
Well, Paul famously says there is no Jew or Greek, there is no man or woman, there is no slave or free in Christ. In his letter to the Galatians. This is not a manifesto for kind of a social revolution. He's not pressing for an equality in the here and now, because Paul's attention is focused on what is to come, on the kingdom of heaven that Christ will bring. But the fundamental idea that there is an essential equality between all human beings, male and female, Jewish and Greek, slave and free, is the animating idea that Paul is teaching. And it's a Jewish idea because it ultimately comes from Genesis, where God creates every human being, male and female, in his image. So every human being has an inherent dignity. This is a very powerful, foundational idea in Christianity, and one that is quite, not one that most people in the Roman world would in any way have accepted. The reason that Paul doesn't condemn slavery as an institution is the same reason that he doesn't condemn famine, or that he doesn't condemn poverty. He just accepts that these are the conditions of living in the fallen world. It never crosses his mind that these are evils that could be campaigned against, that could be abolished. He accepts that they're evil, but he also accepts that humans have to live with them. And this is something that is so deeply rooted in the assumptions of the world that he's born into, and which Christianity emerges, that it takes a long time for people to start to think that Christianity itself should be abolished. So there is a man called a Christian called Gregory, who becomes the bishop of a city called Nyssa in Anatolia, what is now Turkey, who does say, well, Jesus suffered the death of a slave, therefore, in a sense, slaves must be closer to God than the masters, and therefore, if Jesus triumphed over death, he must also have triumphed over slavery, and therefore, properly speaking, we should abolish slavery because it's wrong for one Christian to own another Christian. And this is an idea that his brother, who's also a very, a saint, a radical bishop, builds hospitals, pushes the idea that the sick must be cared for. But he says to his brother, but what will then happen to slaves? Who will look after them? So he sees slavery as a kind of welfare. Now, it's true that over the centuries that follow in Europe, the habit of slavery does fade away, and it's the abolition of slavery is pushed in the 11th and 12th centuries in Europe by people who come to see it as being wrong. What then happens in the 16th and 17th centuries is that Europeans cross the Atlantic to America, and they discover these vast new worlds, and to extract the gold and the silver from the mines of South America, or to work in the sugarcane fields of the Caribbean, or in the cotton fields of the southern part of North America, they need labor. And what are they to do about this? So the answer is that they start importing slaves from Africa. And the effect of this is to racialize slavery. Yeah. So by the 17th century, the idea is starting to bed down, particularly in the English-speaking world, that slaves should be black, and that therefore white people should be free. And this is a racialization of slavery that had not previously existed. Now, the effect of that is to rub up against that idea in Paul and Genesis that all human beings are created equally in the image of God. Because how, if you believe that, can you say that people from Africa should be slaves and people from Europe shouldn't? And the answer to that is that you can't really. And so there are attempts by Christians to kind of justify it. So they say perhaps that Noah cursed one of his sons for being, and that therefore his descendants who were Africans must be slaves to the other sons who were not cursed. But this is a ludicrous argument, and everyone basically accepts that it's a ludicrous argument. And so what happens is that growing number of Christians, recognizing the injustice of racial slavery, start to recognize the injustice of slavery full stop. And they're able to do that because whether they're Quakers or whether they're Baptists or whether they're evangelical Christians, they have a radical Protestant understanding of the Bible, which is that it doesn't really matter what the written text is. It's how the Spirit enables you to understand the text. And although notoriously there is nothing in the Bible that opposes slavery as an institution, that didn't matter to the abolitionists because they felt that the Spirit had opened their eyes, had illumined their hearts, had enabled them to be born again and to recognize the truth that slavery was wrong. And so this, over the course of the 18th century, becomes ever more of an animating principle. And it blazes up like a kind of fire. And, it's the fire of the Spirit, the idea of Pentecost, that the Spirit comes down as fire. This is seen as a fire blazing across the American and the British empires. And in 1814, the British Foreign Secretary goes to Vienna to meet the other foreign ministers from across Europe in the wake of the defeat of Napoleon. And they're trying to draw up a treaty that will enable Europe to get back on its feet after the defeat of Napoleon. But the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Castlereagh, has to go there and say we need to abolish slavery because there's been mass demonstrations all over England pushing for it. And Castlereagh has to push for this. Now, Castlereagh is the leader of a Protestant country. Britain is a Protestant country. But he's talking to the foreign ministers of Spain, of Portugal, of France, the other great slaving nations who are Catholic. So he needs to find a way to square that circle. There is an alternative tradition, different from the Protestant tradition of opposition to slavery in the Catholic world. Because going all the way back to the 12th century, lawyers in Catholic universities had developed a radical idea that of human rights, that human beings had rights to certain things, one of which was liberty. And in the 16th century, when the Spanish went to South America and they enslaved large numbers of the native inhabitants of the Americas, there was opposition to this from the friars, from the Spanish friars. And the argument revolved around the fact that every human being, including the people in America, had rights. And so this is a tradition that gets bundled in with the Protestant tradition, where the European leaders in Vienna construct a model of law that can be international, so that both Protestants and Catholics can accept it. So it's not overtly Christian, but it's a fusing of the two Christian traditions, the Catholic and the Protestant. And then in due course, when European powers start to come up, say, against Muslims, against the Ottomans, against the Arab slave traders in Africa, they oblige Muslims to accept this idea of international law as well. And over the 19th and into the 20th century, the period of Western power, they are able to push this idea so that... Apologies.
It's okay.
So that I'll rephrase that. So that over the 19th and 20th centuries, the period the greatest period of Western power, the various Western states are able to essentially spread the idea that slavery is a moral evil around the world, and that's where we are now. Everyone pretty much now accepts that slavery is an evil, but the assumption that slavery is an evil is basically one that derives from 18th century Protestantism.
Let me make the topic wider. So you mentioned human rights. So you boldly argued that the idea of human rights or morality, even the scientific revolution or the Enlightenment, was under the influence of Christianity. It was surprising. So you also argued that even Spinoza, who was a renowned pantheist, or Marxism, which most believers think of as the extreme opposite of Christianity, could not emerge without Christianity. So while reading the book, I was convinced to an extent, but I had to wrap my head around how radical these claims are. Well, especially in today's academia. So
I think that may
why.
I think that may be because because Korea has not has not been Christian in the way let's say England has been. We've been Christian country for more than 1,000 years. That's true of all the main countries in Europe, Western Europe, have a particular kind of Christianity. And basically, we're like it's like a kind of sauce that we've been marinated in.
Mm-hmm.
And you might take the food that's been marinated in the sauce out, but the flavor is still absolutely shot through. Mm-hmm. Or we're like goldfish swimming in waters that are completely Christian.
Yeah.
That we can't escape it. And even the most vehement critics of Christianity, by and large,
mm-hmm.
couch their criticism of Christianity in Christian terms. So Marx, you mentioned Marx. So Marx would be an obvious example.
Mm-hmm.
Marx famously says that religion is the opium of the is the opium of the people. Yeah. Marx inspires the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution targets institutional Christianity. Mm-hmm. It destroys churches. It smashes up monasteries. Yeah. It wants to get rid of institutional Christianity. But what are the animating principles of Marxism? The idea that the last shall be first and the first shall be last. And that's a phrase of Jesus. Mm-hmm. Jesus says, woe unto the rich. He doesn't say, woe unto the rich who don't give money to the poor. He says, woe unto the rich. Jesus' message is very, very radical. It's a very, mm-hmm. it wants to set the world upside down. That's the implication of his teaching. And the other implication of Jesus' teaching is that his gospel is for the entire world, that it has universal application. And that, again, is something that Marx teaches, that his teachings are for everybody, that they apply universally. Doesn't matter where, they are absolutely universal. So when you look at Marx, he tries to deny this. He tries to say that, his understanding of what will happen, that there will be this, that the time will come where there will be a day of reckoning for the rich, and the sheep and the goats will be divided in two, and at the end of days, peace and order and happiness will be established across the world, mm-hmm. like a New Jerusalem. All of which is obviously completely Christian. He tries to argue that this isn't Christian at all, that it's purely scientific. And he does this by, he goes to the British Library and he number crunches and he does charts and he does graphs and he tries to pretend that it's all very scientific. But it's not scientific. And you only have to read Marx and to sense the kind of moral blast of his fury at, children being worked to death in factories, or women being evicted from their homes by rapacious landlords, or people in distant colonies being worked to death so that the bourgeoisie can have sugar for their tea. The moral anger that is coming from this is not scientific. The moral anger there is something that you can trace back through Jewish and Christian history all the way to the prophets of the Old Testament. That's where the anger is coming from. It's a deeply culturally conditioned anger.
Yeah, it's obviously not came from the Roman or Greek idea.
So in that sense, and again, I don't know what the kind of anti-Christian arguments are like in Korea, mm-hmm. but here, the arguments against Christianity, which go back to the 18th century, basically to the Enlightenment, mm-hmm. are, people will talk about the Crusades, people will talk about the Inquisition, and they will take for granted these are bad things. But why is it bad to launch foreign wars of conquest? The Egyptians did it, the Assyrians did it, the Romans did it. What's the problem with it? And the answer is basically that we assume that you should put up the sword. Blessed are the peacemakers. Again, so Christian actions are being criticized in Christian terms. And likewise, with the Spanish Inquisition, what is offensive to us is the idea that innocent people might be tortured to death by the apparatus of an oppressive state. But why do we find that so upsetting? And the answer is evident in the central symbol of Christianity, which is someone being tortured to death, an innocent person being tortured to death by the apparatus of a state. So we can't escape it. And the person, the philosopher, the thinker who identifies this most clearly and profoundly and unsettlingly is the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who does recognize this, who recognizes that Marxists and socialists and liberals and humanists are all just different shades of Christian. And what I found fascinating about Nietzsche is that he, I think, far more profoundly than most Christian writers, he really, really gets the point of the crucifixion. I mean, he's there with Paul as someone who's shocked by it and appalled by it. Nietzsche, unlike Paul, thinks it's hideous. I mean, he hates the idea that some, a loser, a slave, this guy, we're supposed to admire this. He says, no, it's disgusting. We should admire the strong and the powerful and the beautiful. We shouldn't admire the image of a man, tortured to death on a cross. It's disgusting. But his sense of disgust at it is an expression of how shocking it is. And I think that so Nietzsche was a very radically atheist because he not only dismissed the Christian God, but he dismissed all the Christian beliefs that belief in the Christian God had upheld. And most atheists, certainly in the West, do not do that because they may say, well, we don't believe in God, but their values, their principles, their assumptions are utterly Christian.
Nietzsche would say they are Christian still.
Absolutely, and I think he's basically right.
We didn't mention the scientific revolution much. So in Dominion, you claim that the trial of Galileo was not a conflict between the religion and science, although the widespread misconception says that it was. So in fact, thoughtful historians, I think, seem to teach about the trial more accurately. But despite the accurate context, Galileo has been widely framed as the martyr of science who was victimized by religion. So could you tell us then what really happened during the trial in its accurate context?
Yeah, well, so Galileo, he develops a telescope. He develops kind of radical ideas that the Earth revolves around the sun rather than the sun revolving around the Earth. Yeah. These are not new ideas. These are ideas that have been kind of circulating in Europe for several decades. And the church is not opposed to the notion of this in principle, but it wants proof. And essentially, what's at stake is it's the church that has is being empiricist about this. It's the church that is demanding proof. It's Galileo who is simply asserting without proof because he can't prove it, and that's the issue.
At the time, yeah.
Yeah. So the Inquisition investigates this. They consult all the full range of scholarly opinion, and they come down on the traditional understanding because this is what Aristotle has taught. This is what the vast majority of astronomers agree, that the sun goes around the Earth. And so they say to Galileo, if you can prove your case, then we will look at this again. But until then, please do not go on about it. And Galileo does go on about it. And he's incredibly rude about the Pope, who'd been personally protecting him and who viewed him as a personal friend. So there was a measure of personal betrayal as well. And so the Inquisition basically silences him. And this then gets picked up by Protestants, and it's given as an example of how repressive the Inquisition is and how repressive the Catholic Church is. And what is going on, essentially, is that in the background, north of the Alps, you have the 30 Years' War in Germany between Catholics and Protestants, but it's unbelievably brutal. I mean, it's more destructive of Germany than the Second World War was. More people proportionately die in the 30 Years' War than in the Second World War. And basically, that is why Galileo gets punished as harshly as he does, is that Catholics are actually, are determined to insist on papal authority to try and stiffen Catholic resolve against Protestants, and Protestants are keen to use the figure of Galileo as a stick with which to beat Catholics. And it's Protestants who then pick up this whole idea of Galileo as someone who, it's not true, but the argument comes to be that Galileo gets put into prison, that he gets broken, that he gets, he's put under a very comfortable house arrest. He's not put in locked up in a cell or anything. And in the 18th century, and then even more into the 19th century, this Protestant propaganda starts to be picked up by people who are opposed to Christianity, full stop. So in the 18th century, it gets picked up by Voltaire, the great Enlightenment philosophe, and he basically makes a myth out of it. And then in the 19th century, which is where in English the word science starts to take on the meaning that it has now, enthusiasts for this new concept of science kind of construct a model of history in which there's always been something called religion and there's always been something called science, and they've always been fighting with one another. And they look back and they find kind of various myths that can be used to support this. And among them is the idea, for instance, that the Library of Alexandria had been a great resource of science and then Christians had burnt it down. Not true. It wasn't, the Library of Alexandria was not about science. It was not burnt down by Christians. Doesn't stop it being repeated and repeated and repeated. And likewise, they fix on Galileo as a martyr for science. But basically, when you hear atheists pushing this idea that Galileo is a martyr for science, A, it's a myth, but B, it's a Protestant myth. And it's bred of 17th century religious tensions against the backdrop of the 30 Years' War, and it's just kind of mutated.
That's really interesting, that because people, including me, didn't heard about the Protestant response to the Galileo at all. So it was great to read when I was reading the Dominion. So
I think a lot of certainly in the West, and again, I'm sure it's different in Korea because you very much have your own traditions. But in the West, basically everything is Christian. I mean, we're all shot through with Christian assumptions, and so atheism, by and large, draws on Protestant traditions of anti-Catholicism. So in that sense, modern atheism is a kind of it's an evolutionary offshoot of the Protestant Reformation.
It was a pleasure watching you discuss with Dr. A.C. Grayling, who was a philosopher, on the Unbelievable channel. So in the discussion, Dr. Grayling suggested that some parts of the Eastern thoughts seem to overlap with Christianity. The Korean translator of Dominion also mentioned that the Eastern notion of kindness, human love, or ine, that's an Eastern idea, overlaps with Hesed, is similar to the idea of mercy addressed by Christianity. So if all these notions really originated from Christianity, the question then is how similar notions emerged in places where Christianity was unavailable. So your response to Dr. Grayling felt too short due to the time limit of the debate. So this video will have a wide Korean viewership. So this question is certainly interesting.
So the argument I had with Professor Grayling was not that everything good comes from Christianity. The argument is that our understanding in the West of what is good is Christian. And something else that is Christian is universalizing. The idea that, and this is what makes Christianity and Islam distinctive and unlike, say, Confucian traditions or Hindu traditions, Shinto traditions, is that they aspire to bring the whole world to what they see as the truth. So Christian missionary wants to bring the knowledge of Christ to everybody, and a Muslim wants to see the whole world brought into the house of Islam. So these are Christianity and Islam are in that sense kind of cousins, if you like. They both have this kind of universalist ambition, which is very, very distinctive. The humanism that Professor Grayling represents, in that sense, it seems to me, is recognizably Christian. It too wants to claim to be universal. And its roots again go back to the Enlightenment, where basically the philosophes are, like Spinoza, who's kind of one of the earliest, but Voltaire and Diderot and people like that, they are laying claim to the moral inheritance of Christianity. They're pushing arguments that are deep, but they don't want to allow the Christian Church, and particularly the Catholic Church, to have any purchase on it. So they can't say that we've got these ideas, we've got these traditions, we've got these assumptions from the Catholic Church, or indeed, from Christianity generally. So therefore, they have to argue that these are universal ideas, and that you could find them as readily in Beijing as in Bilbao. And the idea that essentially the way that someone in the 18th century, an atheist or an agnostic in the 18th century, or indeed in the 21st century, sees the world is somehow universal. This is a staggering display of cultural arrogance because it's essentially appropriating every other tradition around the world. Anything that looks vaguely like what, say, Professor Grayling thinks, he says, there you go. We all share the same views. But this is ludicrous because every cultural tradition has its own distinctive perspective on the world that is the result of cultural evolution. So, just as a bat or a bird or a pterosaur may all have developed flight, doesn't mean that they're all the result of the same evolutionary process. It's what's called convergent evolution. And the same thing happens in the field of human culture, that you may get, a thinker here or a philosopher there or a priest there may arrive at the same, may come up with kind of a phrase or a sentiment that sounds similar. But it doesn't mean that they've come from the same source. It means that they are the result of distinctive cultural traditions. And to go around kind of cherry picking bits that you like and saying that this therefore proves that my beliefs are somehow universal is absolutely the height of arrogance, it seems to me. So I think that Professor Grayling should be more honest. I think he should accept that that his views, like everybody's views, are very culturally contingent. They're bred of distinctive circumstances, and those circumstances, in his case, are Christian ones. But he can't bear to do that, and he's like he can't. And the reason he can't bear to do that is because he ultimately is not being objective about it. If he were being objective, he wouldn't mind acknowledging what's evident, that essentially the traditions that influence him as someone who lives in Britain, who's shaped by the inheritance of British history, is Christian. But it's kind of evident. So he's very like, there was a famous debate in the early days of Darwinism between Darwin's great champion, Thomas Huxley, and the Bishop of Oxford. And they had this debate in Oxford. And the Bishop of Oxford demanded of Huxley, on what side, are you descended from a monkey, on your mother or your father's side? And it was a kind of famous sneer, because the bishop couldn't stomach the idea that he might actually be descended from an ape. It seems to me that humanists in the West are exactly like that. They can't face up to the fact that they are the products of cultural evolution, and I don't see why they should be. I mean, what does it matter where your ideas come from? Just accept that they are the product of evolution.
Yeah. So solely reading the book does not seem to reveal how you think of Christianity right now. So do you consider yourself as a Christian, and what do you think defines Christians?
Well, to a degree, I do talk about it, because the very last chapter is all the way through the book. I've been casting myself, I hope, as a kind of objective observer of this. But of course, I'm not objective, because I'm just as much a product of this Christian inheritance as everybody else. And the fact that I'm writing in English, which is a language that is absolutely shot through with Christian assumptions, means that I can't escape it. And so I at the end of the book, I talk about my own upbringing, and I talk particularly about my mother, but more specifically about my godmother, as examples of how I admire them and love them, and I have been shaped by them. And that this is an example, I think, of how and why Christianity has spread in the way that it does, because it tends to be taught by, over the generations, it's been taught by mothers, by people like that, by women who bring up children, as much as by, the priests and the bishops and the theologians who tend to get talked about in the history books. So I feel myself very, very shaped by that. And the truth is that now, having kind of immersed myself in this Christian inheritance and found myself very moved by it, and a sense of recognition and kind of feeling, yeah, this is where I'm coming from. I kind of desperately want to believe in it, and there are times where I do believe in it, but equally there are times where I don't believe in it. So I kind of shimmy in and out of belief.
According to an interview from Capturing Christianity, an audience asked if you accept the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. I remember that you were debating about it inside of your mind. So is the reason for such contemplation a religious reason? Or do you think there are clues that might lead you to think of the resurrection of Christ historically true?
I think it's impossible to prove it historically true. I just don't think we have the evidence for that. Paul's letters are coming in the earliest 20 years after the event. The gospel accounts are later than that. If even today, where people can phone, video things on their phones, there's debate about what's going on. I mean, you just have to look. We're doing this in the aftermath of the Israeli-Palestinian crisis, and all that stuff has been videoed, and still there's debate about what it actually means. So I think it's very difficult to say we can. The conclusive proof for this doesn't exist. What I think does exist, it's clear to me that Paul, and therefore I would guess by extension the people he's writing to and the people whose reminiscences inform the Gospels, definitely thought that he'd risen from the dead. There seems no explanation for the readiness of Christians to suffer and die for that belief unless they really believed it. And what you get in Paul's letters is an overwhelming sense of the strangeness of it. We were talking about this earlier. I'm sure that not only did Paul think that Christ had risen from the dead, but he also believed that the risen Christ had appeared to him personally. And the shock of that is manifest throughout all his letters. And it's clear that Paul picked himself up from this experience of seeing the risen Christ as he saw it and tried to make sense of something that he didn't understand. And he did that by going through the great body of Hebrew scripture and kind of applying his understanding that what the scriptures spoke about was actually what had been manifest in the crucifixion and the resurrection. And that is what the letters are, because Paul's letters are not, as people often think, a kind of arid body of law or instruction. They're like dramatic monologues. It's a man who is sitting down and thinking, I've got to explain something almost that I don't understand. I feel it, but I can't quite put into words. And my comprehension of what has happened, it feels inadequate to I find it hard to put it into words. And that's what makes those letters so extraordinary. And I think, anyone who thinks that Paul would doubt that, I think is cloth-eared. These are letters written by someone who absolutely believes that Christ rose from the dead.
So, I'm going to give you the last question. If there are specific things that the readers must take away from the book, please tell us what they are. So, also, if you would like to say anything to your Korean readers, I think this is the first chance.
It is, yes, it is.
Yeah. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Well, essentially, the argument of the book is that Christianity is the most radical and transformative attempt to explain why humanity is here on the planet that has ever existed. More people have been Christian over the course of history and have believed it than any other attempt to explain why we're here. And that's expressive of, its essence is revolutionary. Its essence is transformative, and it continues to be transformative. In the West, it's often said that Christianity is dying. I don't think, people going to church, it may be not what it was, but we remain in the West deeply Christian in our assumptions. And the convulsions that are going through in the West, Black Lives Matter and so on, are inconceivable without the kind of Christian seedbed. And elsewhere in the world, this is a period of immense Christian growth and revival. And that idea of a kind of fire, Pentecostal fire, a flame, we just had Pentecost, that idea of flame spreading across the world. It's there in South America. It's absolutely there in Africa. In Africa, it's one of the explosive period of growth for the church. And of course, it's there in Asia as well. And Korea is, what Korea is after, I think, the United States, the most, the more missionaries come from Korea than from any other country.
I think so, yeah.
And that's kind of astonishing, considering that 150 years ago there were about 10 Christians in Korea. So I said I wish that I'd had time and space to write about Korea. I've never been to Korea. I don't speak Korean. I don't know a huge amount about the history, but I know enough about it to know that I wish I'd had space to write about it, because in a sense, what people are living, what you're living through in Korea seems to me a kind of radical demonstration of what the book is about, that Christianity has this scope to unsettle things. And you never quite know what it's going to bring. And the idea that is quite popular here in England, where it's much older, that it's somehow conservative and hidebound, and people associate it with kind of musty old buildings. Nothing could be further from the truth. Raising your life and raising a civilization on Christian foundations, it's like San Francisco on the San Andreas Fault. You at some point there is going to be an earthquake and things are going to come toppling down, and that's the role that Christianity plays. And it seems to me that Korea is a fascinating example of that, and one that I long to know more about.
Yeah, please. Thank you so much for your time, and it was a great honor to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the interview. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you.